Now that we have all our evidence, we need to start thinking about how to write those body paragraphs of our paper. There actually is kind of a formula, which we'll go through in more detail in class. But today we're going to look at how to handle the quotes or paraphrase. So let's talk first about, should you paraphrase or should you quote? It may shock you to learn that MLA highly prefers paraphrasing. In fact, earlier MLA guidance indicated that no more than 10% of your paper should be from quotes. That's kind of shocking, isn't it? They've since backed away from that, and the reason is that if you're doing a literary analysis, you really do have to show chunks of the text. Sometimes you have to show the dialogue between two characters in order to show their relationship to one another. So it's not a hard and fast rule, but you can see that MLA greatly prefers that you paraphrase. There are a couple of reasons. One is that for the reader, it's really jarring. Your voice is unique, your writing voice. It's different than any other author. So if the reader is reading along and here's your text, and then suddenly there's a quote from somebody who writes very differently than you do, the reader is being sort of whipsawed. We're brought into your language and then this other author's language and then back to your language. And if you have multiple quotes, it could be from multiple authors. It's very hard on the reader. So if you can explain whatever it is in your quotes in your own words, much easier on your reader. Also, you can get a lot more information condensed if you explain it in your own words. You can pick and choose what you want to include. You don't have to have 3 pages of quotes. So it's always better to paraphrase if you can. But we're going to take a look at what happens when you can't paraphrase, when you absolutely need to have a quote. So you'll start by providing a little bit of context. It's important for your reader to understand who is speaking. Who is this author you're quoting from? And not just a name. The name might not mean anything. Maybe the credentials of the author are more important. Why should I believe this person? It's also important to know what happened previously in the text. If you're quoting from the results of a study, your reader needs a little bit about what that study is, what was done in the study, before the reader can understand the conclusions. So once you've provided that context, and I will show you some examples, you will then present the quote itself. That's straightforward enough. Then you have a job to do. We call this unpacking. It means developing what is in the quote. So if the quote is highly technical, you may have to explain what the quote means to your reader in your own words that are easier to understand. And most importantly, you're going to explain how it supports your thesis. Remember that an essay is an academic proof. And so this piece of evidence that you've given is like a piece of evidence in a court case. You need to keep pointing back to your thesis and show that you're proving it. One of the things I hate is when students airdrop a quote. And by that, I mean when they just present the quote without any context. Here's what it looks like. Doesn't that quote look awful? It looks kind of obscene, actually. So if you knew the context, you probably know the movie Frozen. Olaf is a snowman. But if you don't know that Olaf is a snowman, it looks kind of weird. And also, we need to know what is happening. What's happened in this scene is that Olaf, who's a snowman, his 3 parts have become apart, have become detached. And the bottom layer, which would equate to his butt, has rolled down the hill. So he wants someone to get that missing piece of his body for him. Without that context, this is crazy, and it also looks a little bit obscene. So now we're going to look at some examples that I pulled together to see whether you think we should quote or paraphrase. This is from an article about the Holocaust. I'll give you a moment to read it, and then we'll talk about what the key points are so we can decide whether we need to quote or to paraphrase. So I'll be quiet for a moment while you read. Hopefully you've reached the end of the quote by then. So you can see this is a pretty long quote, and personally I find it a bit repetitive. It doesn't, it, it's not poor writing, but it really, to plunk something that big in the middle of my paper is not doing my reader a good service. So let's think about what I need to convey from this. So part of the issue is that Holocaust survivors are not necessarily looking for a specific term, but they needed to describe what happened to them because other people did not have that experience. Um, Here we have something similar. So now I can see that there's some repetition and maybe it doesn't make sense to include all of that. So I know that they're looking for a way to describe and they were struggling. And then I have this third section um, where there's evidence from memoirs and articles that the survivors either wrote or were interviewed about. Um, and again, saying they don't want to name, but they want to make it comprehensible to those who had not been there. So I can think of several options. One is to paraphrase, to say that in the aftermath of World War II, those who had survived the Holocaust were not interested in labels, but rather they needed to find a vocabulary to describe what happened to them, and they struggled to do that. So I could just say it in my own words. If I wanted to truncate this, to take some of the quote, but maybe not all of it, I think I would either use just this portion here, but then it's incomplete, isn't it? What memoirs and articles? So I would have to tee that up by saying in the aftermath of World War II, some of the Holocaust survivors wrote memoirs or were interviewed about their experience. And then maybe I can just take this portion. So let's say that I have my sentence, I'm going to just separate this out. Um, so I'm going to say, um, in the aftermath of the Holocaust, interviews and memoirs of the survivors revealed that, and I have my quote right there. Now I have to indicate to my reader that I've taken part out of that quote. So I'm going to use what's called the ellipse. It's the three dots to show that there was something before that that I took out of there. If I wanted to start my sentence, we can't because that's not a complete sentence, but just so that you understand what it would look like. If I wanted to start and make that a complete sentence on its own, I would have to capitalize because it wasn't capitalized in the original. So then I use a hard bracket, which shows that this is my edit, not in the original, and I would do something like this. Actually, that does make a complete sentence. So I'm showing the reader that it's not the original, it wasn't a complete sentence, but I'm editing it to make it a complete sentence. Now let's look at another example. This is about the Armenian genocide and the fact that the Turkish government does not acknowledge that this happened. So I'll give you a moment to read why the Turkish government thought that was necessary, that denial of the genocide was necessary. Okay, that's pretty complicated language, but what I wanted to highlight to you is this phrase, these myths, if you just airdrop that in, your reader doesn't know what myths you're talking about. So you might decide that you want to use this entire quote. If you do put this in quotes, by the way, you have a quote within a quote, and so the interior quote gets single quotes, which look just like apostrophes, um, because they're inside the larger quote. So it says this is a quote within a quote. So if I needed to do that, I would have to write something in above to introduce my quote, to show that, to explain to my reader what these myths were that were so necessary. Maybe I don't need this whole middle part though. Maybe I could take this middle part out right here, and that's where I can use my ellipse again, like that. All right, let's look at a third one. This one's very short. I'll give you just a very short while to look at it, and you can decide whether you think we should quote or whether we should paraphrase this. It's so short, it seems like one could paraphrase it, but honestly, when you look at the language here, if you said it in your own words, could you say it any better? And secondly, would it look like you plagiarized? So in this case, because it's so well written and it actually is pretty short, it wouldn't interrupt my text a whole lot, I would be inclined to leave this one the way that it is. Now I want to show you what it might look like when you actually have it in your paper. This is a separate topic here. Um, this is an example of introducing a quote. So first I give a little bit of background. This was a study I found about how Generation Z behaves in the workplace. And this particular study was specific to the hospitality industry. The authors found that it was somewhat, their attitudes were somewhat the same, but also a little bit different than other members of Generation Z. So I introduced that by signaling to my reader that I'm talking about the hospitality industry, that I'm talking about the worker's attitude, and that it's not so cut and dry. It actually is kind of complex. Then I give a little bit of information about what this quote is, and here's my sort of lead in. In this case, the quote completes my sentence, so I don't need to capitalize it. And there's my in-text citation. So I hope this has been helpful to you, demystifying quotes and paraphrase, and I look forward to reading your body paragraphs.